We've now got some basic functionality for our campaign contract put together, and we just tested it inside of Remix to make sure that it's at least somewhat going down the right path so far. The next thing we're going to work on is to implement the idea of a spending request. We have the ability to recruit people or to accept contributions, but we do not yet have the ability to send any money out. So we can't use any of the money we're receiving yet. That's the purpose of the request. Remember, a manager is going to call the createRequest function, and that should create a new spending request. We had said that this request variable was going to be an array that holds a list of individual requests. I want to first talk about what this request thing is going to be in terms of its actual type or data structure. For that, we're going to need a quick refresher on something that we spoke about a couple videos ago. So here's a chart of all the different reference types that are available to us inside of Solidity. We've made extensive use of dynamic arrays so far. We had said that there were also fixed arrays, mappings, and structs. Mappings and structs were vaguely similar in that they were both collections of key value pairs. A mapping was all about storing records or storing some very similar records, whereas the purpose of a struct was to model some given individual object or something. And a good example of that was creating a struct that represents a car. And in this case, maybe a car has a make, a model, and a value assigned to it. So we're going to create a new struct inside of our contract that is going to be called a request. The struct is going to have a couple of different fields that describe the purpose of the request. So let's take a look at another chart that's going to help us understand this request thing that we're going to make. All right, so here's our request struct. These are names of the different fields that we're going to place on the struct. Each field has its own individual type, and then of course every field has its own purpose. We're going to create this new type called struct, or excuse me, this new type called request, and then anytime a manager wants to create a new request, they're going to essentially be creating a new instance of this struct. So you can think of the struct as kind of being like a class of sorts. And if we ever want to make use of it, we have to first create an instance of it. And we'll see some very good examples of that in due time. Let's first talk about the different fields that are on here and why we are using each of them. The first one will be a description field. This is going to be pretty self-descriptive, pun I guess. Anyways, the point of it is to explain to contributors or approvers why the request is being made. So a manager needs to somehow justify any money that is being spent or withdrawn from the contract. A manager might give a request a description of something like, I need to pay this vendor to get some battery casings, or I need to pay this vendor to pay for shipping, or I need to pay this vendor to get some paint, whatever it is. This is going to be the area that a vendor can, or excuse me, a manager can use to justify the expense to all the contributors. Next up is the value. This will be an unsigned int, and it's going to represent the amount of money that the manager wants to send over to this third party or this vendor. So I think this one is also pretty clear. This is how much money we want to withdraw from the contract and have be sent to someone else to pay for something. The next field is also pretty self-evident. It's going to be the recipient. This is going to be essentially the address of the vendor. This is the person who is going to receive some amount of money. In theory, all of our contributors or the approvers can look at this recipient property, look at the address, and have some reasonable belief of, okay, this address I know belongs to this big electronics manufacturer. So if the manager just made a request to send that address some money, chances are they are in fact buying battery casings or LED screens or whatever it is. So this is the person who's going to eventually receive the money. The next one is a little bit more interesting. So this is going to be a field that we're going to call complete. The interesting thing about this request is that we don't really have a great way of knowing whether or not the request has been executed. We don't know whether or not this request has been taken, paid up, and had the money sent out. So we're going to add a simple Boolean to the request that says whether or not the request has been processed or essentially been voted on, approved, and then had the money sent out. Of course, we're going to want to make sure that if the request has already been marked as complete, it should not be able to be sent out or processed again. So once a request is marked as complete, that's it. You cannot send any more money through this request again. The one thing you'll notice that I have left off on this request struct is some type of voting mechanism. So we haven't really discussed how our contributors are going to vote on a request, because remember, that's the entire point of this whole exercise. We want to make sure that whenever a manager creates a spending request, all of our contributors have the ability to vote on it and either approve it or disapprove it. So that's something that we have not yet incorporated into this request struct. We're going to come back to this topic in a video or two because it definitely requires its own separate explanation. For now, let's flip back over to Remix and we're going to create this new type of request. All right, so we'll go back over to Remix. We're going to define the struct at the very top of our campaign. So even above the variables here. Up here, we're going to place the struct keyword, and then after it, I'll place the name of the struct that we are creating. And in this case, it's going to be request, like so. Then inside of here, we'll list out all the different fields that we want this request to have, or we want this struct to have, and we will also list out the variable's type. So we'll say string, and then description, and then finally a semicolon after that. This defines a new field on the struct called description, and as you might guess, it sets its type to be a string. We can repeat the same process for all the other fields that we want to add. And then do take note, we're placing a semicolon after each individual field. So this is distinctly different from JavaScript objects or any other type of object thing you're used to, where usually we separate them by commas. So no commas here, we're doing a semicolon. So next on our list, let's see what we had next. We had, value, recipient, and complete. So value is going to be an unsigned int. The recipient will be an address. And then complete is going to be a Boolean, which is simply bool. So true or false. Complete, like so. Now, one thing I want to be really clear on, because you'll see this request struct that we're creating right here is placed right next to all these other variables. These variables right here instantly created a local or instance variable tied to the contract. So when we said, hey, this thing's going to have an address called manager, then hey, we suddenly got this variable that we could get access to from all of our functions anywhere in the contract. And that's how all these different variables that we've declared so far behave. However, a struct that we define right here is a struct definition. So this does not create an instance of a request. We cannot now go into some function. We cannot do this. We cannot now say like, oh, request is going to be ASDF or whatever it might be. When we place a struct definition, we are introducing a brand new type into our contract in the same way that we have types of address, uint, or array of address. So again, this is a type. It's a definition. It is not an instance of a variable. When we eventually want to make a request, we will create a new variable and we will specify that its type is request. So in closing, just one more time, just to be really clear, this does not limit us to having only one request at a time. We can have as many requests as we want because this is just defining the idea of a request. All right, I think I've hammered that in enough, so let's take a break. We'll come back in the next video and we're going to start implementing some of the logic to allow a manager to actually create a request. So we'll take care of that in the next video.